Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for coming right before Pesach or shortly before Pesach. The shir tonight is dedicated for a refuah shleima for Nata ben Zisel, and as always for all those whose health has been affected by the war, especially for the safe return of our brothers and sisters held in captivity, and tatzlacha to the IDF and to Am Yisrael and the lasting unity of the people of Israel. Amen. Aliyat Neshama, Yitzchak Hirsch ben Eliezer, Dr. Yosef Walder by Eliza Bullow, and by Mrs. Jean Levy for the Ilui Neshama of her beautiful and beloved daughter, Chana Laura Elisa Bat Eicha Jean, who was Nifteret Tesvav Nisan, first day of Pesach at age 23, 18 years ago. Again, may her Neshama have an Aliyah. Finally, Yiboneh is collecting for its annual Kimcha de Pischa fund, raising money to distribute food coupons to needy families. We've already distributed tens of thousands of shekels to families in need, and are in need of more contributions to distribute. To participate in the mitzvah of Moed Chitim, Kimcha de Pischa, they're synonymous. I see they switch terms in the middle there, but they're the same thing. Use the link below in the description box or the Yiboneh website. And Baruch Hashem, it's not only is it a general mitzvah of tzedakah, it's a particular obligation before Pesach. We are obligated to give money for people to be able to afford the tzorchei hachag. You know, it's interesting, there's a pasuk in Micha, the prophet Micha, which God is quoted as saying, Ki mei tzeitzcha me'eretz Mitzrayim ere niflaot. When the time of the Geula comes, I will show you wonders like the days that you left Mitzrayim. That the Geula Acharona is going to be compared in many ways to the Geula Rishona. Ki mei tzeitcha me'eretz Mitzrayim arenu niflaot. And people often ask, you know, why doesn't God do miracles like he did in the good old days? The good old days, splitting of the Red Sea, all of that good stuff. Today, no miracles are happening. If only God would do miracles, I would be a believer. So the truth of the matter is, Ramban says, you know, how many times does God have to prove himself? You know, he did all this stuff. If you believe he did it, then he did it. What does he have to keep on doing it? But there's another way of looking at it. And it says, who says God doesn't do miracles? You know? Maybe you slept through it. I slept through it. But Saturday night, God did a miracle. The idea that Iran sends, almost 400 missiles to attack Israel, and basically, virtually nothing happened. I think one Arab young girl got hurt. I think she was Arab, but she should have refuah shleima. Again, anything is regrettable. But one, that is such an unbelievable rate of success on the part of Israel, that as great as our army is, as great as the Iron Dome is, as great as our security system is, nobody could believe that this was capable of happening. And it is a miracle. It absolutely is a miracle. I've heard people say, and I actually heard a physicist say, who's involved in the security system, that this was a miracle that was greater than anything that happened in the Six-Day War. He said it was greater than the Yam Suf. Okay, I don't know if I could go back and say that. I'm not that old. I wasn't there. But Six-Day War, yeah, And it's an amazing thing. It's just amazing. It's just almost as if, it was said, you may like this or not like this, it was said in 1948 that the establishment of the State of Israel was God giving us a kiss after the Holocaust, after the devastating tragedies of World War II, the loss of 6 million Jews. We were broken, and God needed to give us a hug, show us, yeah, bad things have happened, but I'm with you. And the State of Israel was said to be God's hug after the Holocaust. Again, I'm not explaining the Holocaust, I'm not going there at all, but it was simply the reassurance that I'm with you. Well, Baruch Hashem, even October 7 was not the Holocaust. I don't want to compare that, but still, we're facing a bit of an analogous situation with the massacre of October 7 and the hostages and the constant fear that we have that, who knows what's going to happen every single day. And then something like this happens, in which God's love and God's care is so evident in a supernatural way. So once again, it's kind of God's hug after October 7, that He's with us. That doesn't automatically, solve everything. We still have all of the problems that we have to struggle with. But Hashem is showing us that He's with us. He's on our side. And this is a tremendous thing. The Medrash says that there were different kings. David HaMelech prayed that God should give him victory to fight the enemy. And another person just said, I don't have the strength to fight, I'll just daven. And Chizkiyahu HaMelech said, I can't fight, I can't daven. I'm just going to go to sleep and you'll handle it. Let God handle it. Well, for a lot of people, Saturday night was just went to sleep. I'm not even a heavy sleeper. I'm a very light sleeper because I didn't wake up at all. So I wake up in the morning around like 5:30, and I have 20 emails from the United States expressing fear and concern and how are you and what's going on and are you safe? And then I had no idea what they were talking about, so I look at the news. Now I'm scared to death. Gee, that's what happened. I didn't even know. I didn't hear any sirens. I mean, I said there were sirens, but I didn't hear anything. So it's really what Chazal say, Ein bal hanes makeres niso. Sometimes a person benefits from a divine miracle and doesn't even know a miracle happened. And that's what this is. So it's something we have to think about really very, very carefully. Who knows what will happen the next time? Who knows if there'll be a next time? Who knows? There's a lot of stuff we don't know. And, when God does miracles for you, there's also a reciprocal responsibility to try to give something back in some way. And we got to think about what that's going to entail. But nevertheless, we should revel and rejoice in this Yeshuat Hashem that came in a very, very most unlikely and unexpected way. How Israel should respond, I'll leave to the politicians, although maybe I shouldn't even say my personal opinion. Okay, what is my personal opinion is that this may be the only issue in the Middle East that Joe Biden ever got right. But whatever it is, I kind of agree with him, but I understand the other argument too. So I don't want to get into the politics of it. It's kind of, Baruch Hashem, nothing happened. Let's just go on. We don't need to be involved in a war on multiple fronts. But okay, but I'll leave that to other people to debate and discuss. But right now, we should see that in the month of Nisan is the month of redemption, the month of miracles. And Hashem gave us a Nisan miracle this year, something to be very, very grateful. And maybe, just maybe, it once again is a harbinger, a prediction of Mashiach, based on the pasuk, that before Mashiach comes, I will show you miracles analogous to Yitziat Mitzrayim. Kimei tseischa mieretz Mitzrayim, erenu niflaot. An amazing thing. Now, a lot of what I'm going to talk about, I think we have covered in various weeks. I'm going to bring a few things together. I mean, after all, when we did Chumash Shmos, what were we talking about? We were talking about Yetzias Mitzrayim and the like. So now we're back to Pesach, and we have the same type of inyanim. Let me just start though with an interesting historical point. People ask, when was the first Seder? So obviously the first Seder was in Egypt. The night before we left Mitzrayim, we had a Korban Pesach, and we ate the Korban Pesach, and we sat around that last night recounting. Well, we couldn't recount everything because some things haven't happened yet. We couldn't recount. Right? What was the story of the Exodus before there was an Exodus? So obviously, we were not yet talking about things that didn't happen yet, but we were talking about things that were going to happen. And we talked about the plagues, and we talked about the faith in God, all of those things. So that was the first Seder. The second Seder was 1 year later, exactly 1 year later. We're in the desert, and we had one Korban Pesach in the Midbar. Right, that was the second Seder. That was actually pre-Man, because the man didn't start falling into. No, I'm sorry. The The month started the Eor before. Yeah, so the month had been falling for 11 months. But okay. Now, if we then ask, when was the next Korban Pesach that was brought? It was in the days of Yehoshua ben Nun. The rest of the 40 years in the desert, there was no Korban Pesach. The holiday of Pesach, in terms of not doing malacha, presumably they kept as one of the mitzvahs of the Torah, but they didn't bring the Korban Pesach. They didn't eat matzah. They didn't eat maror. They didn't do any type of Haggadah. They didn't do any type of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. So it's very, very interesting that for the 40 years in the desert after the first Pesach, there actually was no Korban Pesach till Yoshua ben Nun. Now, there's something a little odd even about the Yoshua ben Nun Pesach. It mentions that from the time of the spies onwards, no children that were born, no male children that were born had a bris. Meaning all children born in the desert after the sin of the spies did not have Brit Milah. Why was that so? So the Gemara discusses that as a result of both the sin of the Egel and the sin of the spies, we were no longer protected by God to the same degree that we had been protected before. We had man, we had the clouds of glory, but we didn't have all of the healing that God gave us. And as a result, it was considered to be a sakana to do circumcision while we're actively traveling. So as a result, an entire generation of Jewish boys in the desert did not have Brit Milah. Now, what is the halacha of Korban Pesach? You cannot bring a Korban Pesach if you are uncircumcised. But more than that, you can't bring a Korban Pesach if any of your children are uncircumcised. Which means to say, if I would have a son, and this is even if it's medically necessary, meaning even if it would be a sakana, like hemophilia, for the baby to have a brit. So I'm excused. I'm not allowed to bring a Korban Pesach. So there is a reason why they didn't bring a Korban Pesach in the desert for those 40 years. At least some of the families had boys who were not circumcised, and that would prevent the fathers and the mothers from bringing the Korban Pesach. Now that wouldn't necessarily cover everybody, because not everybody had a boy any given year. I mean, let's say I didn't have a boy in year 2 or whatever it will be. But the other reason why they didn't bring a Korban Pesach was because the Korban Pesach is really connected to a Beis HaMikdash, meaning it's the other way around. Bringing it in the desert was the exception. The norm would be you'd have to wait till Eretz Yisrael and the like. But what's interesting is they finally did bring a Korban Pesach in the days of Yeshua ben Nun, and in the book of Yeshua it discusses there was a mass circumcision ceremony. Hundreds of thousands of people had to be circumcised in order to bring the Korban Pesach. Ki mulim hayu kol hayotzim. The people who left Mitzrayim were circumcised. The people who were born in the desert were not circumcised. They're the ones coming to Eretz Yisrael. We have to circumcise them. But here is the oddity. There is another halacha that got activated when they came to Eretz Yisrael. This is very fascinating. This is the Easter of eating chadash. Now, I don't want to get too detailed, but just in terms of just understanding something. What is chadash? Chadash applies to grain, particularly grain that grows in the land of Israel, mainly. Grain that grows in the land of Israel, the 5 grains, not kidneys, the same 5 grains that become chametz: wheat, barley, oats, rye, spelt. That new grain that grows cannot be consumed until you bring a sacrifice of barley on the second day of Pesach, which is called the Omer sacrifice. Chadash is Asr until the Korban Omer is brought. Now, you may then ask me, so how can I ever eat Chadash today if we don't have a Beis HaMikdash and the Korban HaOmer is not brought? So the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah explains that there's a two-tiered system. When there is a Beis HaMikdash, you cannot eat the new grain until the Korban of the Omer is brought. When there's no Beis HaMikdash, it is the start of the day of the Omer, meaning the Omer is brought on the second day of Pesach, which is the 16th of Nisan. So when there's no Beis HaMikdash, you can't eat the grain of the new year until the morning of the 16th of Nisan. But Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai was metakein that you got to wait until the 17th of Nisan. In other words, he basically said that that day is no longer permitted. The reason is because maybe the temple will get rebuilt, and if you got used to eating it first thing in the morning, that's not going to be allowed when the temple is built, because you're going to have to wait till they bring the Omer. You see? In other words, if they bring the Omer at 12 noon, you couldn't eat the Chadash till 12 noon, but if you got into the habit of eating it at 6 in the morning, then next year when the temple gets built, you'll eat at 6 in the morning. So they therefore said, don't eat it on the 16th at all. And when the temple is built, then you'll eat it on the 16th when they bring the Omer. Okay, whatever it is. So the practicality simply means the following. Even today, I cannot eat Chadash till the morning of the 17th of Nisan, and Doraisa until the morning of the 16th of Nisan. I cannot eat Chadash on the 15th, meaning anything I eat before the 16th or 17th of Nisan has to be grain that preceded last year's Omer date. So now, this raises a very intriguing question. The first Seder that we have in Eretz Yisrael. Now, what were we eating? We came to Eretz Yisrael. We crossed the Jordan River. The book of Yoshua says, we crossed the Jordan River on the 10th of Nisan. Right? Moshe died the 7th of Adar. We mourned Moshe for a month. And then we made 3 days of preparation, crossed the Jordan on the 10th of Nisan. That's a month and 3 days after Moshe died. At that point, we were living on mun, that even though mun normally only lasted, mun stopped falling when Moshe died. But God allowed the mun not to spoil, so we were living off mun. We come to Eretz Yisrael. Are we allowed to eat the grain of Eretz Yisrael? We are not. It's Chadash. And Chadash is not going to be permitted till we bring an Omer offering on the 16th of Nisan. So we lived off the man, or we lived off fruits and vegetables, or meat, or cheese, or eggs. There's a lot of stuff you can eat, but we couldn't eat grain. Okay, so you might think that's not a big deal. Okay, so I don't eat grain. Like plenty of people, gluten intolerance, they don't have grain. But here's the problem. How did they fulfill the mitzvah of matzah at the first Seder they had entering the land of Israel? All of the grain is Chadash. No Omer had ever been brought yet. The Chadash is not going to be permitted till they bring the Omer offering on the 16th of Nisan, the second day of Pesach. So the first night of Pesach, we could have moror, we could eat the Korban Pesach. Okay, Baruch Hashem. We couldn't eat the matzah, or could we? So the Talmud Yerushalmi actually says they did not fulfill the mitzvah of matzah at the first Seder. See, do you understand why it's only a problem this year? Because after the first year, even though they can't eat the new grain, they could eat grain from the prior year, which was covered by last year's Omer offering. because last year they brought in Omer. But the first year, they didn't bring an Omer till the second day of Pesach. So all the grain is Chadash. If all of the grain is Chadash, they're not allowed to eat it till the second day of Pesach. So, actually the Bavli says it as well. I mentioned the Yerushalmi because Yerushalmi has Sakash on it, but both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi say absolutely they did not fulfill the mitzvah of matzah at the first Seder. In some ways, it's kind of like starting off on a bad foot. I mean, this is your first Seder in Eretz Yisrael, and you can't eat matzah. Very strange. So that's an interesting historical point that I wanted to share with you. Let me just mention the interesting question of the Yerushalmi. The Jerusalem Talmud asks a fascinating question. There is a general rule in halakha that if something is prohibited by a negative commandment, thou shalt not do something. But I have a positive mitzvah to do something. And the only way I can do the positive is by transgressing the negative. I don't have another choice. So what do? Do I obey the negative and not do the positive? Or do I say, listen, I got a positive commandment and I don't have any way out, so maybe the positive overrides the negative, right? And you understand the problem here. I have a conflict of directives. The negative commandment says don't do something. The positive commandment says to do it. So if I have a way of doing the positive without the sin, of course I got to do that. That's obvious. But if I don't have any other alternative, which has precedence, the positive or the negative? So halacha gives you an answer. Halacha basically says the obligation of doing a mitzvah overrides the prohibition of not doing something. This is called aseh, the positive commandment. Docha pushes aside lo ta'aseh, the negative commandment. Aseh docha lo saseh. The most common example, although it may not be totally apt, is the notion of doing a brit milah if a baby is born on Shabbos. Now, doing a bris actually involves violating malachos. You're causing bleeding and bruising. So it's a negative commandment. It's desecration of Shabbos. On the other hand, there's a positive commandment to circumcise on the 8th day. So what do? The positive commandment of Brit overrides the negative commandment of Chilul Shabbos. Aseh, docha, lo sasa. So the Talmud Yerushalmi asks a very logical question. Isn't that exactly the situation the Jews found themselves on the first Seder night in the time of Yoshua? On one hand, there's a negative commandment, do not eat the new grain until the Omer is brought. On the other hand, we have no other grain. All we had was mun. Mun is not kosher for matzah. It may taste like matzah, but mun is not matzah. Matzah requires from the grains itself. We have no other grain. And if that's the case, the positive commandment of matzah should override the negative commandment of not eating the chadash. So that's a kasha the Talmud Yerushalmi asks. It does give various answers. We don't have to get into all the technicalities, but I just wanted to bring out the historical anomaly. Okay. And there's a lot of logistical problems in Pesach, a lot of logistical problems. It's interesting. I assume most people here have migrated from Chutz La'aretz. I don't think anyone here was actually born in Israel. So all of us remember the old country, the olden days, where we had 2 Siddharim. And some people say, maybe most people say, that having one day Yom Tov is one of the greatest benefits of living in Eretz Yisrael, particularly for Pesach. On the other hand, I have heard a respectable minority who actually say they miss a second Seder because it gives you a chance. Practice makes perfect. It gives you a chance to get it right. There may be different types of Torah insights that you didn't want to use up all the time the first night because it was getting late, but that way you can split it. You have 2 occasions to try to bring out different ideas. So logistically, a Seder is a difficult experience. First of all, it can be uplifting, it can be joyous, it can be redemptive, it should be redemptive. But part of it is logistically difficult because how are you going to pitch it to the many different types of people and different types of interests that exist in the audience? On one hand, the Seder seems to be something that should focus primarily on children, very much so, because the mitzvah itself in the Torah is described, V'higareto levincha, you shall tell your child. This is the occasion when a parent tells his child about what does it mean to be Jewish, what is our history, how did we become a nation of God, and what does Yetzias Mitzrayim mean for us? The notion of contemporizing Yetzias Mitzrayim, even though it may sound a little avant-garde, is, I would suggest, not at all a foreign idea. We have to ask ourselves, what does it mean that we were slaves in Mitzrayim and God took us out of that slavery? What are the implications? What is the significance of that for the way we live our lives on a day-to-day basis? These are very important questions. On the other hand, we also have adults. We might have grandparents, we might have aunts and uncles and the like. So you got to kind of throw a lot of balls in the air, and you have to try to speak to everybody on some level. But then you run into the problem, jack of all trades, master of none, in which the attempt to try to do a little bit for everybody means that nobody totally gets everything they need. So I don't have an answer to that. I can't even give you an answer to that. You just do the best you can and pray that at some point the Kadosh Baruch Hu will take over and give you the siyata d'shmaya to try to make it inspiring and the like. Let me just remind people that if a person, let's say you have some people who really want to talk a lot about the Haggadah and the Seder, and other people, maybe elderly, they need a quicker Seder, you can talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim even after the Seder is over. So you can do the Seder relatively quickly, and then be marbe in Yetzias Mitzrayim after the Seder, and you are still fulfilling the mitzvah of V'higareto levincha. Okay, so that's something one should think about. You can do a lot of post-Seder learning and speaking of Divrei Torah and the like. I've said before that one of the major themes of the Exodus is the linkage between freedom and responsibility. You'll notice that we start counting the Omer, the 49 days between the bringing of the Omer and Shavuos, the second day of Pesach. In Chutz La'aretz it would be the second Seder, in Eretz Yisrael it's already the first day of Chol HaMoed. The Ramban suggests that actually means Pesach, which is freedom, and Shavuos, which is Torah, are not considered to be two separate holidays. They are one holiday. And in fact, the whole Omer period can be regarded as a long Chol HaMoed. Of course, Pesach has its own Chol HaMoed, but there's first day of Pesach, Chol HaMoed, last day of Pesach. But then the Ramban says the whole period of the Omer is like a Chol HaMoed connecting holiday number 1, which is Pesach, with holiday number 2, which is Shavuos. And in fact, this is borne out by the rabbinic name for the holiday of Shavuos. The rabbinic name for the holiday of Shavuos is a bit strange if you're not familiar with it. It is called Atzeres. When Chazal say the word Atzeres, they are not talking about Shemini Atzeres. The word Atzeres in the Mishnah is Shavuos. Why is that so? The word Atzeres means conclusion. One of the meanings of the words. Shavuos is the conclusion of Pesach. What's the message? Freedom has value only when it is used as a vehicle to submit to God and live your life in accordance with His will. Pesach is worthless unless it's connected to Matan Torah, submission to God's will, God's morality. You see, this is kind of a mistake that we have in modern culture. Freedom is not an end in and of itself. A person says, the goal of my life is to be free. That's a meaningless statement. Free to be what? Free to do what? Freedom is not a goal. Freedom is a very, very important means to achieving a goal. Yes. So I agree that even political freedom is an important thing. But it's important not because it's intrinsically important. It's important that through freedom, I am able to achieve the meaningful goals of a life. So freedom is a means, it's not an end. Erich Fromm, who happened to be Jewish but not observant, a Talmud of Sigmund Freud, who also happened to be Jewish, not observant, although Freud himself came from a line of rabbis. Erich Fromm once remarked, we make a very big mistake when we define freedom as being freedom from something. Freedom has to be understood as freedom towards something. Right? Or in the language of Aristotle, you have to look at liberty as a positive liberty rather than a negative liberty. A negative liberty simply means absence of restriction. Positive liberty is the creation of a sense of values that gives your life structure and purpose. I think I mentioned more than once the beautiful metaphor of the Indian poet Tagore, who's not Jewish. I don't even know if he knew any Jews. He described a human soul like a violin string. Within every soul is a tremendous capacity to generate music. If you take a violin string and it's totally loose, it's not attached to any instrument, put a free, unattached string on your dining room table, your kitchen table. What sound will you be able to get out of that string? Nothing. Paradoxically, in order for that string to produce music, it has to be tied down. It has to be confined. It has to be limited. It is only within the structure that the music of the string gets revealed. A human soul is very much the same. It is in the structure of submission that we achieve liberty. Otherwise, we are just slaves to the Yetzer Hara. We are slaves to whatever passions we have, whatever emotions we have. Freedom is when we have the inner strength to do the right thing, even if my urges would pull me in a different direction. In fact, it's been well said. People think bechira, freedom, means I can do whatever I want. Real freedom is I can decide to do what I don't want to do, but I should do. And I don't have to do what I want to do. In other words, it's the other way around. Instead of saying freedom is the ability to do what I want, freedom is the ability not to do what I want, if doing that is not good. That's a person who's free. A person who's free is a person who says, I don't have to give in to that urge. I'm better than that. That's freedom. That's freedom. It's an amazing thing sometimes. You see it with kids, and I know some stories where the adults were enormously impressed. A story about a non-religious grandmother takes her Haredi children to a kosher-style restaurant in New York or whatever it is, because that's the place where she has her social circle. And the owner offers the kids candy. And kids love candy, right? And the kids looked at the wrapper. They didn't see a hechsher, and they said, "We're sorry, we can't have the candy." And the guy went crazy. The guy said, "I never saw children like this. Children who are able to have the discipline." He almost became a Baal Tshuva there. He was so absolutely amazed at that notion of, "I'll turn down the candy if that's not what I'm supposed to do," and the like. Those are, Baruch Hashem, those are things to think about. So the point I'm making is, this is why in the Jewish calendar, Pesach and Shavuos are linked by the counting of the Omer. You see what the counting of the Omer does? The counting of the Omer says, on our day of freedom, or our season of freedom, we think about Torah. Now Chazal made the point in a very interesting way. They pointed out that the grain offering of Pesach, the grain offering, which is the Omer offering, is barley. Barley, before cholent was invented, was commonly fed to animals. The grain offering of Shavuos is wheat, which is human consumption. So moving from Pesach to Shavuos is moving from animal liberation to human dignity. Meichel behema versus Meichel Adam. You see? And that's why we need counting of the Omer. Now, you might have thought, well, gee, let me think about the next holiday after this holiday. Why should I be thinking about Shavuos in the middle of Pesach? It's actually a violation of another principle. You don't intermingle one joy with another joy. So I'm thinking about the Omer, I'm counting towards Shavuos. When I'm celebrating Pesach, the answer is yes. Shavuos gives meaning to Pesach. Now we see this in another way, that's interesting. There is an Ashkenazi custom, I don't know if Sephardim practice this, and it's a custom, it's not a din, although for some reason some Ashkenazim take this mamish more chomer than eating matzah. That is, that the first thing that you eat after you finish the matzah, the moror, and the sandwich, the korech, and you're ready for the meal, finally. So the first thing that is served is a hard-boiled egg, dipped in salt water. Again, it's a minhag. If you're watching your cholesterol, don't worry about it, you don't have to have it. But it's an old minhag that people have a hard-boiled egg at the Seder. Why is that so? So the explanation that's given is, a hard-boiled egg is also the first food that you give a mourner. When a mourner comes back from the funeral, from the levaya, he's going to sit shiva. So people bring him food. This is a very important halacha. The avel should not have to get himself food. People bring him something to eat. And among the things that are brought to him is an egg. And the reason is because an egg is an oval shaped, and it represents the wheel of life. Life is perceived as a wheel of good experiences and bad experiences, difficult times and joyous times. And the circular or oval nature of the egg reminds a person that there is a cycle in life, that yes, there may be tragic and difficult times, but there will also be good and joyous times. In fact, it's reminiscent of the famous Medrash, which I see now, they made it into jewelry and the like, in which Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest of all people, asked a craftsman, give me a ring that when I ponder the ring, it will keep me in equanimity, meaning to say, I will not become arrogant when I am successful, and I will not become despondent when I fail. Give me a motto that will sustain me in all aspects of my life. And the inscription on the ring was, Gam ze ya'avor. This too shall pass. I'm arrogant, I'm proud, I think I'm the greatest guy. Gam ze ya'avor, be humble. I'm broken, I'm suffering, I'm defeated. Gam ze ya'avor. Things will get better. Gam ze ya'avor. And you can actually buy a Gamzeh Yavor ring. They sell it now in jewelry and the like. So part of the egg is telling the Avel, Gamzeh Yavor. But you'll ask me, so what does that have to do with Pesach? Why do I have that message on Pesach? The Seder is a happy occasion. So one answer is this. The reason is that the first day of Pesach always falls out the same day of the week as the 9th of Av later in the summer. So if Pesach this year is Monday night, Tuesday, Tisha B'Av is going to be Monday night, Tuesday. And therefore, we remember, especially when we don't have the Korban Pesach, we remember the Chorban Beis HaMikdash at the Seder. And we eat the egg to give us comfort. So it's a very strange symbolism. So not only are we bringing in Shavuos, in the counting of the Omer, of course that's the next day, but we're also bringing in Tisha B'Av with the eating of the egg. There are no coincidences in the Jewish calendar. Why would it be so that the first day of Pesach, the day of liberation, the day of freedom, is going to be the same day as the 9th of Av? Why should that be? So here is my speculation. I have no source for it whatsoever, but it's a thought. And the thought is, the first day of Pesach is the only day of the Chag that is not yet connected to the counting of the Omer, because you don't start counting the Omer till day 2. So the first day is pure freedom without a connection to submission to Hashem. So maybe the lesson is, freedom without submission leads to Tisha B'Av and destruction. In a sense, the egg takes the place of the Omer, right? The Omer counting is designed to remind me of the linkage between freedom and responsibility. What happens is, first night Seder, you don't have the Omer. That is the function of the egg. Remember Tisha B'Av. A freedom that is not connected to submission to God will inevitably lead to destruction. And so that, once again, so we see a number of ways in which Pesach and Shavuos are going to be linked. That freedom without Torah is not only meaningless, but it's actually destructive. A person doesn't have any, they're like a kite that's not being held. It just floats out, it floats up into the stratosphere. There's nothing holding it down. There's nothing that gives it a structure, a purpose. You know, I mean, I don't want to get too far afield, but it's no accident that the teen suicide rate is relatively high in primarily affluent countries. You know, it's interesting. In very poor countries, suicide rates are very low. Because the reason is because when you got to spend the whole day looking for a piece of bread, you don't really have time to be philosophical and think about the purpose of life. You got some more immediate concerns. But precisely when basic physical needs are more or less met, is when people are consumed with angst, depression, despair, anxiety. We're hardwired for purpose and meaning. That's the nature of a neshama, a godly soul that seeks connection to the transcendent, seeks connection to the spiritual. You know, when people try to drown themselves in whatever it is, in drugs, in alcohol, in sex, in workaholism, these are distractions, because inside there's an aching need for meaning and for purpose, for connection to something greater than yourself. And you don't know, without a Torah, without some type of guide like that, you don't know where to go, what to do with it. And that can result in suicide, as well as violence to others. I mean, that self-loathing can easily spill into killing others. That's why every week in the United States there's some school shooting somewhere and the like. But it comes from the emptiness of a person who is starving to fill up the aching void within them. They don't know how to do it. That is a life of freedom without submission to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The emptiness of that life. Sometimes it's better to be a slave. The slave, doesn't have the time, just like the person looking for bread, to be distracted with these questions. Once we're confronted with these questions, they're very hard to escape. And God forbid they can result in some very, very extreme consequences. Right? So that was really one point I wanted to share with you, the idea that we got to focus on. It's wonderful that we're free, but what do we do with our freedom? Again, it's kind of analogous a little bit to these people who win the lottery, right? It's a well-documented phenomenon that the people who win millions and millions and millions of dollars in the lottery are almost at 100% rate, like totally miserable for the rest of their lives. They're miserable because, number one, they're like thousands of people come out of the woodwork, claiming to be their friends. And they misinvest the money. They don't know what to do with the money. A guy's been working as a janitor, and he wins $100 million lottery. He says, I'm going to buy an airplane. Whatever. There literally is. There's no sense of what my life is about. When you don't have that purpose, the physical world is not going to satisfy you. So, I don't want to lecture too much, but as I say, we have to think in ourselves and try to communicate to our children. But once again, you can't communicate to your kids something that you haven't understood yourself fully. Is, what does it mean to be free? What do you do with your freedom? What's the purpose of things? Right? Now again, I'm not saying you can discuss all of this at the Seder, maybe not, but it is something to think about in the course of the year. Remember that the mitzvah to remember the Exodus is not just Leil Pesach. The mitzvah to remember the Exodus is every single day and night of the year. So this is a discussion you can have any time, but Pesach might be a time where, at some point during Pesach, you think about this, have this type of discussion. What is the meaning of freedom? Now, one point I did suggest, again, I may have said this a few weeks ago, is that you see from the Torah that Yetziat Mitzrayim is actually the source of Jewish compassion and Jewish empathy. The Torah says many times, you shall love the ger, love the convert, because you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Actually, it says you were Gerim. You should love the ger. Ki Gerim hayisem v'eretz Mitzrayim. Now, let's just plug in our translation here. We normally translate ger as convert. But if that's the case, the sentence doesn't make sense. Love the convert because you were converts in the land of Egypt. We were not really converts of the land of Egypt. So you have to go back to the original etymology. Yeah, ger means a convert. Ger means a non-Jew converted to Judaism. But the literal meaning of ger is the stranger, the other. Remember what it was like to be a ger in biblical times, and to some degree even today, but certainly in biblical times. In biblical times, economy was land-based. Right? You owned land that was kept in the family. Ad kedei kach that even if it was sold, it would go back to your family in the Jubilee year. A land-based economy, an agrarian economy. An economy or a society based on tribal affiliation. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. And now we have a ger. A ger doesn't own land. A ger has no tribal connection. A ger has no protexia, to use a modern word. He comes to you as the stranger. He comes to you as the other. The natural inclination of a person who is secure and comfortable in his life is he doesn't pay attention to the insignificant people on the bottom rungs of the ladder. Not that he's going to be bad to a ger, but he's not going to pay attention. I'm sitting pretty. I got my land. I got my tribe. I got my clan. And whatever he's doing is his business, not my business. What is the Torah's message? The Torah's message is, when you see people who are powerless, you see people who are weak, you see people without influence, remember their pain, because it once was your pain. Remember not just the exodus of Egypt, remember the slavery of Egypt. Remember what it was like to be a slave. Remember what it was like to be a nobody. Remember what it was like to be poor and humiliated and afflicted and abused. And use that collective memory as the source of empathy and compassion to others who are going through that same experience. This is a remarkable insight of a lot of contemporary application. You know, we live in a culture, more so in America than Israel, but in America certainly it's a big thing, where victimization or victimhood is almost a professional status. Everybody is a victim. Again, I don't want to get too political. I don't know if any of you came across the unfortunate incident at Dean Erwin Chereminsky's house in Los Angeles. Whatever. He's a Jewish guy. He's not religious at all. He's the dean of University of Southern California Law School. He's a Jewish guy. He actually his field is freedom of speech and First Amendment. He's a very eminent constitutional scholar, and his wife is a law professor as well. So every year he invites students over to his house for a barbecue. So he invited like the Palestinian students and the like. Hospitality, he was very, very nice. So one woman wearing a hijab gets up and she takes a loudspeaker and starts giving a YouTube, she starts recording herself giving an anti-Israel speech. So the professor said, please, stop that or leave my house. You're a guest in my home, and I don't want you to make the speech in my home. And, there's no First Amendment right to make speeches in somebody's home. Go somewhere else and make your speech. And the wife, I think maybe the wife overstood a little. The wife put a hand on the woman, giving her a little push. And the woman starts saying, she made a whole public thing, I have never been so abused in my whole life. The professor's wife, fondled my breast. It was just a wild exaggeration, and turning it into sexual assault and criminal assault and battery and everything else. So these things, happen, as it were, that one has to realize that being a Jew is still very, very precarious in this world. So the notion of identifying with the outsider can be taken to extreme and absurd. In other words, the point I want to make is that don't take a good point and turn it into absurdity. Yes, one of the lessons of Yetzias Mitzrayim is empathy, compassion, looking at the suffering of all people, Jews and non-Jews. Absolutely. But don't allow victimization to be taken to absurd. So in the United States, everybody's a victim of something. How does the Torah view victimization? So here's what the Torah says. If you have been victimized, instead of using your victimization as a shield for entitlement, use your victimization as a source of empathy and compassion for others. And then you're no longer a victim. You become a hero. Now, these are dangerous words to say, and I may very well get negative responses, because I want to make it absolutely clear. There are certainly victims in the world, very serious, who have suffered sexual abuse, emotional abuse. We have to have compassion. We have to have respect. We have to take the steps that protect them. There is no question about that. And I want to make it very, very clear. I am not demeaning the legitimate, I'm not defending the abuses that people have suffered. But you see, if that victimhood becomes a narcissistic preoccupation with self-entitlement, then you're living your whole life as a victim. The Torah's message is extraordinarily powerful. Remember your slavery. Remember your victimhood. Remember your pain. Don't make believe it didn't exist. But use that pain as the source of how you help others. It's a tremendous idea, and it also has a very healing effect on the victims themselves. When a victim can kind of go beyond themselves and use their pain as a catalyst to help others, they become redeemed. They become liberated. They can move on. Their life acquires a purpose. Okay, so it's, again, something to think about. This idea that one of the lessons of Yetziat Mitzrayim is the notion of feeling the pain of others through the empathy of remembering the collective pain that we went through. In that connection, I'll just end with a little story. Some of you might have read the biography of Rav Yaakov Yosef Herman. This is All for the Boss. It's a remarkable book. Rav Yaakov Yosef Herman was the father-in-law of, was the father of Rabbi Scheinberg, the father-in-law of Rav Chaim Pinchas Scheinberg, one of the great Gedolei Ador, the one who wore 100 pairs of tzitzis. He looked stocky. You wouldn't know. He looked like a football player, but he really was quite thin. But he wore 100 pairs of tzitzis. Nobody knows why, and none of his children do it, and he told them not to do it, but whatever, this was his thing. But his father-in-law was Rav Yaakov Yosef Herman, who lived in New York, and the end of his life lived in Eretz Yisrael. He came from Europe to New York, and then eventually spent the last years in Israel. And he was a remarkable person. I mean, he was religious at a time when very few Jews in America were religious. And his daughter, Ruchama Shein, Rebbetzin Scheinberg's sister, wrote a very loving biography of her father, filled with beautiful, beautiful stories. Bichlal, Ruchama Shein was a great writer anyway, but filled with stories, and all for the boss. So it's one of those inspirational books of stories of great people that it might be worthwhile to read. So she tells a story in the book. I'm not totally accurate in every fact here, but I'm going to give you the general gist of the story. She says that her father came to America with his parents when he was like 11 years old, or whatever it is. His parents quickly saw that they could not make it here. So they went back to Europe. But they left him alone. They thought America was better for him. They left him alone in the country as a young boy. Can you imagine that? They set him up with a relative, charging rent for a room that was something like $5 a week, which in the 1920s actually was expensive rent, but it was manageable. As soon as the parents left, the rent was raised to $10 a week. At that point, little Yaakov Yosef, who was working, there were no child labor laws in those days, he couldn't afford it. He got evicted. He got evicted Friday afternoon. He spent all of Shabbos in Central Park, which granted was safer then than it later became. And you can imagine, maybe you can't imagine, how frightened he was. All he had was 2 little rolls with him, He was cold. He was lonely. He was frightened. He was scared. His parents weren't there. He had no place to go. He had no home to live. And what's going to happen after Shabbos? He had a job, but in those days, you know how it was. If you didn't go to work on Shabbos, you had to find a new job on Monday. You worked from Monday, because Sunday was off. You worked from Monday to Friday. You were expected to work on Saturday. Didn't show up on Saturday? No job. So what's going to be? He really was in a situation of abject hopelessness. There seemed to be no way out. So he told his daughter, years later, that night was the most frightening, scary, despondent night of his life. But at some point, he got himself together, little boy, and he said, he doesn't know how and he doesn't know where or what, but he has emunah shalema that God will take care of him. And then he said to God, he asked God for one thing only. He asked God that he should never forget the pain and the loneliness that he feels tonight. That when he becomes successful, and he was sure he would become successful, he wants to remember what it's like to be bereft of everything. So when he meets people who are suffering, he will know what they went through. This was the prayer of a little boy in Central Park, which granted was safer then than it later became. And you can imagine, maybe you can't imagine, how frightened he was. All he had was 2 little rolls with him. He was cold. He was lonely. He was frightened. He was scared. His parents weren't there. He had no place to go. He had no home to live. And what's going to happen after Shabbos? He had a job, but in those days, you know how it was. If you didn't go to work on Shabbos, you had to find a new job on Monday. You worked from Monday, because Sunday was off. You worked from Monday to Friday. You were expected to work on Saturday. Didn't show up on Saturday? No job. So what's going to be? He really was in a situation of abject hopelessness. There seemed to be no way out. So he told his daughter, years later, that night was the most frightening, scary, despondent night of his life. But at some point, he got himself together, little boy, and he said, he doesn't know how and he doesn't know where or what, but he has emunah shalema that God will take care of him. And then he said to God, he asked God for one thing only. He asked God that he should never forget the pain and the loneliness that he feels tonight. That when he becomes successful, and he was sure he would become successful, he wants to remember what it's like to be bereft of everything. So when he meets people who are suffering, he will know what they went through. This was the prayer of a little boy in Central Park. The story goes that Baruch Hashem, eventually he became successful. He was in the fur business, and he married a Rebbitzin. He married a woman who became his Rebbitzin, and they had a house which not only had all the visiting Rosh Hashivas of Europe, Rav Yochanan Wasserman and Rav Baruch Ber, they ate there, but it wasn't only great Talmidei Chachamim. This was a house that was open to people that we would not be very comfortable having in our house. People who were mentally ill, people who were dirty, people who kind of extended their stay for 6 months or longer. They just didn't leave at the end of the meal. People who were abusive to him and to his wife. And when people would ask, when the normal people would ask him, how can you bear these crazy people? He would say, I know what they're feeling. I know what their life is like. I remember it. And therefore we have compassion for them. We don't reject them. Because I know, I've been there. And Lamaisa, in the Depression, he lost his fortune as well, and then he moved over to Israel, etc. So he had ups and downs even after his successes. But he prayed to Hashem that he should remember that suffering. And to generalize this point a little bit more, part of the idea is that in all adversity, there is redemptive potential. In all suffering, we don't know why Hashem brought it. We can't really explain God. But we ask ourselves always, what can I gain from this? How can I grow from this? How do I become a greater person from this? This is the lesson of Yetzias Mitzrayim. To understand that the slavery itself gave us something. It's not just the leaving Mitzrayim, it's the being in Mitzrayim gave us something. And that's true for all the many Mitzrayims that people have. Life can be very, very difficult. Here in Israel, we're going through difficulties. But apart from the national struggles that we have, which are obviously very, very significant, and of course the national struggle turns into the personal struggle when your own family is involved. But we have whatever challenges we have in many, many, many areas. And we can get overwhelmed, or we can get crushed, we can get defeated, we can get despondent. But the message of Yetzias Mitzrayim is to understand there is a redemptive potential in all of that adversity, and our job is to find the Geula even within the Galus. In fact, there's no accident, the Maral says, that Galus and Geula share so many letters. He says basically, Geula is seeing the Echad, seeing the Aleph, seeing God in the exile, seeing God in the darkness. It converts Galus into Geula. Right? And that's really what our job is, to kind of see Hashem even in the darkest moments. So I wish you all a Chag Kosher V'Sameach, and thank you for coming. And may Nisan once again be a time of Geula, Baruch Hashem, on the 6th of Nisan. As I said at the beginning, we were Zocheh to miracles. May we be Zocheh to many, many more miracles. The release of the hostages, Shalom in Klal Yisrael, in Eretz Yisrael.
It's